Master Sergeant Sarah had seen enough in her 22 years of military service to know when something was wrong. Dead wrong. Standing in the humid Georgia heat outside Moody Air Force Base, she watched another F-16 Fighting Falcon taxi down the runway, its engine roaring with what sounded like authority. But Sarah heard something else in that roar, something that made her stomach clench with worry. The young pilot in the cockpit was Lieutenant Jake, barely 25 years old, with the kind of cocky smile that reminded Sarah of her younger brother. Jake had been complaining of headaches for weeks, dizzy spells that came and went like summer storms. He'd mentioned it to Sarah during their pre-flight checks, laughing it off as too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Sarah wasn't laughing. She had been tracking a pattern for months now, keeping detailed notes in a worn leather journal that she carried everywhere. Pilots were getting sick. Not the obvious kind of sick that grounded them immediately, but a creeping illness that started with headaches, moved to fatigue, and then things got worse. The problem was the fuel. Sarah was convinced of it. As the base's lead aviation fuel systems specialist, she knew every pipeline, every storage tank, every filter in the fuel delivery system. And she had been noticing irregularities in the fuel samples, trace amounts of contamination that the standard tests weren't catching. 3 weeks ago, she had submitted her first official report to Colonel, the base commander. A stern man in his 50s with silver hair and a permanent scowl had barely glanced at her findings before dismissing them. "Sergeant," he had said, not even looking up from his paperwork, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but our fuel meets all military specifications. These pilots are probably just dealing with stress from increased training schedules." Sarah had tried to explain about the pattern she was seeing, about the subtle changes in the fuel's chemical composition that suggested contamination from the storage tanks, but had held up his hand, cutting her off. "That's enough, Sergeant. I don't have time for theories. Stick to your job and let the medical staff handle pilot health concerns." That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, 2 more pilots had reported similar symptoms. Lieutenant Amy had collapsed during a briefing last Tuesday, complaining of severe nausea and blurred vision. Captain Tom Bradley had been found unconscious in his quarters on Friday morning, his roommate calling for medical help when Tom couldn't be awakened for his scheduled flight. Both incidents had been quietly swept under the rug, attributed to exhaustion and dehydration. But Sarah knew better. She had tested the fuel from the tanks that supplied the aircraft these pilots had been flying. The contamination levels were getting worse. Now, watching Lieutenant's F-16 disappear into the morning sky, Sarah felt a familiar weight in her chest. She had tried going through proper channels. She had followed protocol, submitted reports, requested meetings. All she had gotten in return was dismissal and barely concealed irritation from her superiors. Part of the problem, Sarah knew, was that she didn't fit the typical mold of what people expected from someone in her position. At 38, she was older than most of the pilots she worked with, but younger than the senior officers who made decisions. She was also one of only 3 women in her specialty on the base, which made her stand out in ways that weren't always comfortable. Colonel, in particular, seemed to view her with suspicion. During their meeting 3 weeks ago, he had made several comments about female intuition and emotional responses that had made Sarah's jaw clench. She had bitten her tongue then, maintaining the professional composure that had served her well throughout her career. But professional composure wasn't saving lives. Sarah pulled out her cell phone and dialed the number for the base medical facility. Dr. Jennifer, the chief flight surgeon, had always been fair with Sarah, treating her with the respect her rank and experience deserved. "Doctor, this is Master Sergeant. I need to talk to you about the pilots who have been getting sick. I think I know what's causing it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I can't discuss specific medical cases over the phone. You know that." "This isn't about specific cases. This is about all of them. I believe we have a fuel contamination problem that's affecting pilot health. I've been tracking it for months." Another pause, longer this time. "Have you reported this through your chain of command?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "I tried. Colonel won't listen. He thinks I'm being emotional or something." "Sarah," Doctor's voice carried a note of warning, "you need to be careful about going around your commanding officer. I understand your concerns, but there are proper procedures." "The proper procedures aren't working." Sarah's voice rose slightly, and she took a deep breath to calm herself. "Doctor, I've been doing this job for over 2 decades. I know fuel systems better than anyone on this base. Something is wrong, and if we don't figure out what it is soon, we're going to lose pilots." Doctor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. "Meet me at my office after duty hours tonight. Bring whatever documentation you have. But Sarah, be prepared for the possibility that this might not go the way you hope." As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked up at the sky where Lieutenant's F-16 had disappeared. Somewhere up there, a young pilot was flying an aircraft fueled by contaminated gas, his body slowly being poisoned by the very system designed to keep him in the air. Sarah made a decision then, standing in the Georgia heat with the sounds of military life bustling around her. If the proper channels wouldn't listen, she would find another way. She would document everything, gather every piece of evidence, and she would not stop until someone took her seriously. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, she could already hear the inevitable phone call that would come if she failed. The call that would tell her that another pilot was down, another young life cut short by a contamination that could have been prevented. Sarah had been ignored and dismissed for the last time. Whatever it took, however many careers she had to put at risk, including her own, she was going to make sure the truth came out, even if it meant challenging the entire chain of command to do it. 2 days after her conversation with Doctor, Sarah sat in the base medical facility's conference room, surrounded by manila folders and printouts that represented months of meticulous record-keeping. Doctor reviewed each document with the careful attention of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance. "These fuel sample results," Doctor said, pointing to a series of charts Sarah had prepared, "they show increasing levels of contamination over the past 6 months." "Exactly. And look at this." Sarah pulled out her leather journal and opened it to a page covered with neat handwriting and dates. "Every pilot who has reported symptoms has flown aircraft that were fueled from tanks 7, 9, and 12. Those are the tanks showing the highest contamination levels." Doctor frowned, comparing Sarah's notes to the medical files she had brought. "I can't officially confirm specific pilot symptoms, but the timeline you've outlined here does correspond with certain patterns I've been seeing." Sarah felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. "Doctor, I think the contamination is coming from deteriorating tank linings. The base fuel system is over 30 years old, and some of these tanks haven't been properly inspected in years. If the protective coating inside the tanks is breaking down, it could be leaching chemicals into the fuel." "What kind of chemicals?" "Based on my testing, I'm seeing traces of heavy metals and organic compounds that shouldn't be there. In small doses, they might not cause immediate symptoms, but with repeated exposure—" Sarah trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Doctor closed the medical files and leaned back in her chair. "Sarah, this is serious. If you're right, we could be looking at long-term health effects for dozens of pilots." "I know. That's why I had to come to you. Colonel won't even look at my reports anymore." "Speaking of Colonel," Doctor said carefully, "I should tell you that he called me this afternoon. He knows about our meeting tonight." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What did he say?" "He reminded me that fuel system maintenance falls under his jurisdiction, not medical. He also suggested that I should be careful about entertaining unsubstantiated theories from personnel who might be seeking attention." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Seeking attention. After 22 years of dedicated service, of working twice as hard as her male colleagues to prove herself, of earning every stripe on her sleeve through competence and determination, she was being dismissed as someone seeking attention. Dr. I'm not finished. Doctor's voice carried a steely edge that Sarah had never heard before. I told Colonel that, as the chief flight surgeon, I have a responsibility to investigate any potential threat to pilot health, regardless of the source of the information. I also reminded him that questioning my medical judgment could be seen as interference with patient care. Sarah stared at her, hardly daring to hope. However, Doctor continued, I also have to tell you that Colonel has scheduled a meeting for tomorrow morning. You, me, and him. He wants to address this situation once and for all, in his words. Sarah's brief moment of hope faded. She knew what that meeting would be like. Colonel would dismiss her findings, probably question her competence, and make it clear that further disruptions would not be tolerated. She had seen it happen to other enlisted personnel who had tried to challenge officer decisions. But as she gathered her documents preparing to leave, Doctor spoke again. Sarah, there's something else you should know. I've been doing some checking of my own. The symptoms you've described, headaches, fatigue, nausea, difficulty concentrating, they're consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning. If your fuel contamination theory is correct, we could be looking at permanent neurological damage in some cases. The words hit Sarah harder than any dismissal from Colonel could have. Permanent damage. Young pilots, barely out of their teens, potentially facing lifelong health problems because of contaminated fuel that should have been caught months ago. There's more, Doctor continued. I reached out to a colleague at the Centers for Disease Control, unofficially, of course. She told me that there have been similar cases at other military installations over the past few years, fuel contamination leading to pilot illness. In every case, the problem was initially dismissed by base commanders as stress or training-related issues. What happened? How were those cases resolved? Doctor's expression was grim. In most cases, they weren't resolved until there was a serious incident, a crash, a pilot collapsing during flight, something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the medical facility. You mean they waited until someone died? I mean they waited until the problem became impossible to deny. As Sarah drove home that night, her mind raced with possibilities. She could go to the meeting tomorrow, present her evidence again, and hope that somehow Colonel would listen this time. But based on his past behavior, she knew that was unlikely. She could try to go over his head, contact someone higher up the chain of command. But that would be career suicide. A master sergeant challenging a colonel's judgment rarely ended well for the enlisted person, regardless of who was right. Or she could do something that went against every instinct of military discipline she had developed over 2 decades of service. She could go outside the chain of command entirely. Sarah pulled into her driveway and sat in her car, staring at her modest duplex in the small neighborhood just outside the base. She had bought this place 10 years ago, seeing it as a sign of the stability and success she had built through her military career. Now it felt like something she might lose if she pushed too hard against the system that had given it to her. But then she thought about Lieutenant, somewhere out there probably dealing with another headache that he would dismiss as stress. She thought about Lieutenant, who had looked so pale and shaken after collapsing during that briefing. She thought about Captain Bradley, found unconscious in his quarters. Sarah made her decision. The next morning, before her scheduled meeting with Colonel and Doctor, Sarah sent an encrypted email to a contact she had made years ago during a joint training exercise. Major Helen Torres worked at the Pentagon, in a division that investigated safety issues across all military branches. More importantly, Major Torres had a reputation for taking safety concerns seriously, regardless of who raised them. The email was brief and professional. Major Torres, I am writing to alert you to a potential fuel contamination issue at Moody Air Force Base that may be affecting pilot health. I have documented evidence of contamination and a pattern of illness among pilots. My attempts to address this through local command have been unsuccessful. I am requesting guidance on proper procedures for reporting this concern to appropriate authorities. As Sarah hit send, she knew she was crossing a line that she couldn't uncross. She was challenging not just Colonel, but the entire system of military hierarchy that had governed her professional life. But as she walked toward the building where Colonel was waiting to dismiss her concerns once again, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Someone somewhere was going to listen. The meeting was scheduled for 800 hours in Colonel's office, a space designed to intimidate. Awards and commendations covered the walls, along with photographs of shaking hands with various high-ranking officials. Behind his massive oak desk, an American flag stood at attention and sat beneath it like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Sarah entered with her documentation folder, maintaining the military bearing that had become second nature over her career. Doctor was already seated, her expression neutral but supportive. Colonel didn't look up from his paperwork as Sarah took her seat. Master Sergeant began, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. Doctor has briefed me on your concerns regarding our fuel systems. I've decided to address this matter directly to avoid any further confusion. Sarah noticed the way he emphasized the word concerns, as if her months of careful documentation were nothing more than unfounded worries. Sir, I have significant evidence that. Held up his hand, cutting her off. Sergeant, I'm going to stop you right there. I've reviewed your previous reports, and frankly, I'm concerned about your approach to this issue. You seem to be operating under the assumption that you know better than the qualified officers and technicians who oversee fuel operations on this base. Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, with respect, I am a qualified technician. I've been working with aviation fuel systems for over 20 years. You're an enlisted specialist, Sergeant. You maintain systems. You don't make policy decisions or conduct investigations that could affect base operations. Leaned back in his chair, his tone becoming more condescending. I understand that after so many years in the same position, you might feel the need to expand your role, but that's not how the military works. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest. She was being dismissed not because her evidence was wrong, but because she was a woman, an enlisted person, someone who didn't fit idea of who should be making important observations. Doctor cleared her throat. Colonel, if I may, Sergeant's technical expertise is exactly why I took her concerns seriously. The medical patterns she's identified correspond with symptoms I've been seeing. Turned his attention to Doctor, and Sarah noticed his tone became more respectful, though still dismissive. Doctor, I appreciate your thoroughness, but correlation isn't causation. These pilots are under tremendous stress. They're flying more hours than ever, dealing with complex training scenarios, and maintaining the kind of physical and mental standards that would challenge anyone. It's not surprising that some of them are experiencing fatigue and stress-related symptoms. Colonel, Sarah interjected, the contamination levels in tanks 7, 9, and 12 are measurably higher than. Sergeant's voice cracked like a whip. You will speak when spoken to. Your job is to maintain fuel systems according to established procedures, not to second-guess the testing protocols that have been in place for decades. Sarah stared at him, feeling 22 years of military discipline warring with her growing frustration. She had seen this before: women and enlisted personnel being shut down not because they were wrong, but because they didn't have the right rank or gender to be taken seriously. Furthermore, continued, I'm concerned about your recent behavior. Doctor mentioned that you approached her outside normal channels, essentially trying to circumvent the chain of command. That's not acceptable. Doctor shifted uncomfortably. Colonel, Sergeant came to me with legitimate safety concerns. As chief flight surgeon, I have a responsibility to. You have a responsibility to work within the system, Doctor, just as Sergeant does. Turned his gaze back to Sarah. Which brings me to my main point. Sergeant, your recent actions suggest that you're having difficulty accepting the boundaries of your position. I'm recommending that you undergo a fitness for duty evaluation. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A fitness for duty evaluation was military code for, we think you might be mentally unstable. It was a career killer, a way to sideline someone who was causing problems. Even if she passed the evaluation, the mark would follow her for the rest of her service. Sir, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, I am fit for duty. I am simply trying to prevent what I believe could be a serious safety incident. That's exactly the kind of thinking that concerns me, Sergeant. You've convinced yourself that you've identified a crisis that doesn't exist. You're seeing patterns where there are none, attributing normal stress reactions to imaginary contamination. This kind of paranoid thinking. Let the sentence hang in the air, and Sarah understood the message perfectly. She was being labeled as paranoid, unstable, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. But then something unexpected happened. Doctor stood up. Colonel, I need to inform you that I've documented several cases of pilot illness that align with Sergeant's timeline. As a medical professional, I cannot ignore the possibility that there's a connection. His expression darkened. Doctor, I hope you're not allowing personal feelings to cloud your medical judgment. Personal feelings. Doctor's voice carried a dangerous edge. Colonel, are you suggesting that my medical assessment is compromised because I'm taking seriously the concerns of a female NCO? The room fell silent. Sarah watched as realized he had crossed a line. Questioning a doctor's professional judgment based on gender was the kind of statement that could end a career, especially in today's military. That's not what I said, backtracked quickly. I simply meant that. I know exactly what you meant, Doctor interrupted. And I want to be crystal clear about something. I am the chief flight surgeon on this base. If I determine that there's a potential threat to pilot health, I have the authority to ground aircraft and initiate investigations. I don't need your permission to do my job. Sarah stared at Doctor in amazement. The doctor was putting her own career on the line, standing up to a base commander who clearly had no problem destroying the careers of women who challenged him. His face was red now, his carefully controlled demeanor slipping. Doctor, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position on this matter. Making baseless accusations about fuel contamination could have serious implications for base operations and your own career. Is that a threat, Colonel? The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Sarah realized she was witnessing something rare, a direct confrontation between two officers with everything on the line. Seemed to realize he had gone too far. He took a deep breath and resumed his controlled tone. Of course not, Doctor. I'm simply pointing out the consequences of acting on unsubstantiated theories. Doctor gathered her files and stood up. Colonel, I'll be conducting my own investigation into pilot health patterns. If I find evidence supporting Sergeant's concerns, I'll be taking appropriate action. Good day. As Doctor left, turned his attention back to Sarah. His expression was cold now, any pretense of professional courtesy gone. Sergeant, you're relieved of fuel systems duties pending your fitness evaluation. Report to Sergeant Major for reassignment to administrative duties. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her world. Administrative duties meant filing paperwork and answering phones. It meant being removed from the very system she needed to monitor to prove her case. Sir, this is dismissed, Sergeant. As Sarah walked out of his office, her career effectively over, she thought about the email she had sent to Major Torres at the Pentagon. It would take time for any investigation to start, if one started at all. Meanwhile, pilots would continue flying aircraft fueled from contaminated tanks. But as she passed Doctor in the corridor, the doctor gave her a subtle nod. Sarah realized that while she might have lost this battle, the war was far from over. Someone was finally listening, someone with the authority to do something about it. Now she just had to hope it wouldn't be too late. 3 weeks after being relieved of her fuel systems duties, Sarah sat at a metal desk in the base administrative office, processing supply requests and updating personnel files. The work was mind-numbing, clearly designed to break her spirit and encourage her to either accept defeat or leave the military entirely. Colonel's strategy was working better than he probably realized. Sarah's fitness for duty evaluation had been scheduled and rescheduled twice, each delay adding to the uncertainty that hung over her career like a storm cloud. Her security clearance was under review, which meant she couldn't access the fuel systems data she needed to continue her investigation. But the worst part was watching aircraft take off every day, knowing that pilots were still being exposed to contaminated fuel, while she sat powerless to do anything about it. Doctor had tried to maintain their unofficial collaboration, but she was walking a tightrope of her own. Any overt support for Sarah's theory could be seen as insubordination, and was clearly watching for any excuse to move against her as well. The only bright spot was that Major Torres from the Pentagon had responded to Sarah's email. The response was carefully worded and non-committal, but it indicated that Sarah's concerns had been forwarded to appropriate personnel for review. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sarah was updating a supply inventory when Sergeant Major approached her desk. A career military man in his 50s, had always been fair with Sarah, though she could see the sympathy in his eyes when he looked at her now. "Colonel wants to see you in his office, now." Sarah's stomach clenched. The fitness evaluation results must have come back. She had met with the military psychologist twice, answering questions designed to determine if her concerns about fuel contamination represented rational analysis or paranoid delusion. The sessions had been professional but unsettling, with the psychologist probing not just her technical observations but her motivations for challenging authority. Walking to his office, Sarah passed the flight line where she could see Lieutenant preparing for another training mission. He looked tired, she noticed, and seemed to be moving more slowly than usual. The sight made her heart ache with frustration. His office felt even more intimidating than before. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman in civilian clothes sat across from his desk, her expression unreadable. She was perhaps 45, with graying hair and the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Master Sergeant," began, "I'd like you to meet Ms. Summers from the Air Force Inspector General's office." Sarah's heart leaped. The Inspector General's office investigated misconduct and safety issues across the Air Force. Major Torres must have passed along her concerns after all. But's next words crushed that hope. "Ms. Summers is here to investigate allegations that you've been making false reports and attempting to undermine base operations through unfounded safety claims." Sarah stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. Somehow, her attempt to report a safety issue had been turned into an investigation of her own conduct. Ms. Summers opened a file folder and looked at Sarah with professional detachment. "Sergeant, I need to ask you some questions about your recent activities. You're not under arrest, but I want to make sure you understand that your answers could affect your military career." "Ma'am, I understand, but I need you to know that my concerns about fuel contamination are based on documented evidence and—" "Sergeant," Summers interrupted, "let's start with your unauthorized contact with Pentagon personnel. On March 15th, you sent an email to Major Helen Torres alleging safety violations at this base. Is that correct?" Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. "Yes, ma'am, but I was seeking guidance on proper reporting procedures for." without going through your chain of command, interjected, in violation of established protocols. Colonel, I had tried to work through proper channels. My reports were dismissed, and I was concerned that pilots were at risk. Ms. Summers made notes in her file. Sergeant, do you understand that making false safety reports is a serious offense? It can disrupt operations, damage morale, and waste resources that could be used for legitimate safety concerns. Ma'am, my reports aren't false. I have documentation showing. Documentation that has been reviewed by qualified personnel and found to be inconclusive, said. Sergeant, you've allowed personal issues to cloud your judgment. Personal issues. Sarah couldn't keep the anger out of her voice now. Colonel, this has nothing to do with personal issues. This is about fuel contamination that could kill pilots. Sergeant, Miss Summers said sharply, raising your voice to a superior officer is not helping your case. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She realized that everything she said was being interpreted through the lens of the narrative had constructed, that she was an unstable enlisted person making false claims to get attention. Ma'am, may I ask if anyone has examined the actual fuel samples I collected? Has anyone independently my test results? Ms. Summers consulted her notes. According to the reports I've reviewed, standard fuel testing procedures have been followed, and all results have been within normal parameters. But those standard tests don't detect the specific types of contamination I identified. The heavy metals and organic compounds I found require different testing methods. Leaned forward. Sergeant, you're not qualified to determine what testing methods should be used. That's a decision for officers and senior technical personnel. Sarah felt herself being pushed into a corner. Every piece of evidence she presented was being dismissed, not because it was wrong, but because she didn't have the authority to present it. Furthermore, continued, your recent behavior suggests that you're having difficulty accepting feedback from your superiors. The fitness evaluation results support this assessment. Ms. Summers pulled out another document. Sergeant, the psychological evaluation indicates that you show signs of what the examiner called excessive persistence in maintaining beliefs despite contrary evidence. This suggests a pattern of inflexibility that could affect your judgment. Sarah stared at the document, recognizing the language of bureaucratic character assassination. Her determination to investigate what she believed was a safety issue was being reframed as mental instability. Based on these findings, said, I'm recommending that Sergeant be reassigned to a position where her condition won't pose a risk to operational effectiveness. What kind of reassignment? Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Ms. Summers closed her folder. Sergeant, you're being transferred to Air Force Base in Montana, effective immediately. You'll be working in supply logistics, handling inventory management for non-critical supplies. Montana, a remote base in the middle of nowhere, handling pencils and toilet paper instead of aircraft fuel systems. It was military exile, a way to end her career without the messiness of a court-martial. Ma'am, I request permission to appeal this decision. I believe there are serious safety issues that. Sergeant interrupted, the decision is final. You have 72 hours to report to your new duty station. Your replacement has already been assigned. As Sarah walked out of his office for the last time, she felt the crushing weight of defeat. 22 years of service, a spotless record, technical expertise that had been recognized and respected throughout her career, all of it meaningless in the face of a system that valued hierarchy over truth. But as she cleaned out her desk that afternoon, packing the personal items that represented 2 decades of military life, Sarah made a decision. She might be leaving Moody Air Force Base, but she wasn't giving up. Somewhere in Montana, she would find a way to continue fighting. Because she knew that sooner or later, if the fuel contamination wasn't addressed, The symptoms she had been tracking would progress from headaches and fatigue to something much worse. And when that happened, the blood would be on the hands of everyone who had chosen to silence her instead of listening. Sarah had been defeated, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. Sarah had been at Air Force Base for 6 weeks when she got the call that changed everything. She was inventorying office supplies in a windowless warehouse, surrounded by boxes of printer paper and cleaning supplies, when her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Doctor's number, and Sarah's heart immediately began racing. Doctor wouldn't call unless something was seriously wrong. "Sarah," Doctor's voice was tight with strain. "I need to tell you something, but I have to be careful about what I say over the phone." Sarah stepped outside the warehouse into the harsh Montana wind. What happened? "There was an incident yesterday. An F-16 went down during a routine training flight. The pilot didn't make it." Sarah's legs nearly gave out. She leaned against the warehouse wall, fighting waves of nausea. "Who?" "Lieutenant." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jake, the young pilot with the cocky smile who had been complaining of headaches for months. The pilot Sarah had watched take off that morning 6 weeks ago, when she had first felt the crushing weight of being ignored by her superiors. "What happened?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "The investigation is still ongoing, but witnesses say the aircraft seemed to be flying normally, then suddenly went into an uncontrolled dive. Jake didn't eject. They're saying mechanical failure, but..." "But what?" Doctor was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I've been keeping track like you asked. Jake had been to the medical facility 4 times in the past month. Headaches, dizziness, problems with concentration. I tried to ground him twice, but he kept passing the basic flight physicals." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the Montana sun on her face while her heart broke for a young man she had tried to save. The fuel. It was the fuel, wasn't it? "I can't say that officially, but Sarah, there's more." Sarah waited, dreading what she was about to hear. 3 more pilots have reported symptoms in the past week. Severe symptoms. Lieutenant collapsed again, this time during pre-flight checks. Captain Bradley has been hospitalized with what they're calling severe fatigue syndrome, but his blood work shows signs of heavy metal toxicity. "Have you told anyone? Have you connected this to the fuel contamination?" "I've tried, but Colonel has made it clear that any suggestion of fuel contamination will be seen as spreading Jake's, your unfounded theories. He's ordered me to focus on stress-related explanations for pilot illness." Sarah felt rage building in her chest, white-hot and consuming. Jake was dead, other pilots were getting sicker, and was still more concerned about covering up the problem than solving it. "Doctor, you have to do something. You have the medical authority to." "Sarah, I'm walking a very thin line here, has already questioned my judgment once. If I push too hard without absolute proof, I could lose my position entirely. And then who would be looking out for these pilots?" Sarah understood the impossible position Doctor was in, but understanding didn't make it any less frustrating. "What about the investigation into Jake's crash? Won't they examine all possible causes?" "The investigation is being led by Colonel's people. They're focusing on mechanical failure and pilot error. Any mention of health-related factors has been specifically excluded from their scope." Sarah leaned her head against the warehouse wall, feeling the full weight of institutional denial. A young pilot was dead, others were critically ill, and the system was more interested in protecting itself than protecting the people it was supposed to serve. "Doctor, I need you to do something for me. I need you to get samples of Jake's blood from the autopsy, and samples from the other sick pilots. Can you do that?" "Sarah, I can't just..." "Please, I know someone who can do independent testing. Someone outside the military system who won't be influenced by politics or career concerns." Doctor was quiet for a long moment. "Who?" "My sister. She's a toxicologist at the CDC in Atlanta. She owes me a favor, and she has access to testing equipment that can detect the specific contaminants I identified in the fuel. Sarah, if I get caught taking biological samples without authorization. Jake is dead, Sarah interrupted, her voice hard. How many more pilots have to die before we stop worrying about authorization? That evening, Sarah called her sister Lisa from her small apartment on the Montana base. Lisa had followed a different path than Sarah, choosing civilian service in public health instead of the military. But the sisters had always been close, and Lisa had often expressed admiration for Sarah's technical expertise and dedication. Sarah, I haven't heard from you in months. How are you doing up there in Montana? Sarah cut straight to the point. Lisa, I need your help with something important, life and death important. She explained the situation as clearly and concisely as she could, the fuel contamination, the pilot's symptoms, the dismissal of her concerns, and now Jake's death. Lisa listened without interruption, and when Sarah finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, what you're describing sounds like chronic heavy metal poisoning. The neurological symptoms, the progression from headaches to coordination problems. If these pilots have been exposed to contaminated fuel for months, their bodies could be shutting down at the cellular level. Can you test for it, if I can get you blood samples? I can test for it, but Sarah, you need to understand what you're asking. If I find evidence of poisoning and you're right about the cover-up, this becomes a federal case. People could go to prison. Jake is already dead, Lisa. If we don't act, more pilots will die. Lisa sighed. Get me the samples, I'll run the tests, but we're going to need more than just blood work to prove your case. 3 days later, Doctor called Sarah with news that made her blood run cold. Sarah, I have the samples you requested, but there's something else. Captain collapsed during flight yesterday. She managed to land the aircraft, but she's in intensive care. Her liver and kidney functions are shutting down. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness. Was she flying aircraft fueled from the contaminated tanks? Tank 9, the same tank that fueled Jake's aircraft the day he died. That night, Sarah made a decision that would either save lives or destroy what remained of her military career. She called Major Torres at the Pentagon, the contact who had initially forwarded her concerns to the Inspector General's office. Major Torres, this is Master Sergeant Sarah. I contacted you several months ago about fuel contamination at Moody Air Force Base. Sergeant, yes, I remember. Your concerns were forwarded for investigation. Ma'am, that investigation resulted in my transfer and an attempt to discredit my findings. Meanwhile, a pilot is dead and others are critically ill. I have new evidence that proves the fuel contamination is real and is causing the deaths. There was a long pause. Sergeant, that's a very serious accusation. What kind of evidence? Blood samples showing heavy metal poisoning consistent with the contamination I identified. Medical records showing a clear pattern of illness among pilots who flew aircraft fueled from specific tanks, and documentation of a systematic cover-up by base command. Sergeant, if what you're saying is true, this is a matter for federal investigators, not military command. But you need to understand the implications. Making false accusations against superior officers is. Major Torres, Sarah interrupted, with all due respect, I'm not making false accusations. I'm trying to save lives. And if the military won't investigate this properly, then maybe it's time to involve civilian authorities. The line was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Major Torres spoke, her voice careful and measured. Sergeant, I want you to compile everything you have. Every document, every test result, every piece of evidence. Send it to me through encrypted channels. If your allegations are substantiated, I'll make sure they reach the right people. And if they're not substantiated according to military review, Then I'll make sure they reach the right civilian authorities. Because if you're right about this cover-up, it's not just a military matter anymore. It's a criminal matter. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her small Montana apartment, surrounded by boxes of evidence she had accumulated over months of investigation. She thought about Jake, about Captain fighting for her life in intensive care, about all the pilots who were still flying aircraft fueled from contaminated tanks. She thought about her 22 years of military service, about the career that had defined her adult life and was now hanging by a thread. She thought about the easy path, staying quiet, serving out her time in Montana, retiring with her benefits intact. But then she thought about Jake's cocky smile, about the young man who had trusted the system to keep him safe while he served his country. The system had failed him, and now he was dead. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing her report to Major Torres. This time, she held nothing back. Every detail of the contamination, every instance of dismissal of her concerns, every piece of evidence that had been ignored or suppressed. As she typed, Sarah realized that she was writing more than just a report. She was writing Jake's story and Captain's story, and the story of every pilot who had been put at risk by a system more concerned with protecting its reputation than protecting its people. She was also writing her own story, the story of a woman who had refused to be silenced, even when silence would have been safer. When she finished, Sarah encrypted the file and sent it to Major Torres. Then she sat back and waited for the consequences. One way or another, the truth was finally going to come out. The call came at 500 hours on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Sarah had sent her comprehensive report to Major Torres. Sarah was already awake, unable to sleep as she waited for news about Captain, who was still fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. "Sergeant, this is Special Agent Maria Santos with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. I need you to pack your things immediately. You're being flown back to Georgia today." Sarah's heart raced. "Am I under arrest?" "No, Sergeant. You're being recalled as a key witness in a federal investigation. A car will pick you up in 30 minutes. The flight back to Georgia gave Sarah time to think about everything that had happened since she first noticed the fuel contamination patterns. 6 months of fighting a system designed to silence her, 6 months of being dismissed and transferred, 6 months of watching pilots get sicker while the people in charge looked the other way. Now finally, someone was listening. Special Agent Santos met Sarah at the airport, a professional woman in her 40s, with the kind of direct manner that Sarah found reassuring after months of dealing with military bureaucracy. "Sergeant, I want you to know that your sister's test results on the blood samples were instrumental in launching this investigation. The levels of heavy metal contamination she found were consistent with chronic exposure to the compounds you identified in the fuel system." Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with grief. She had been right all along, but her victory had come at the cost of Jake's life and Captain's health. "How is Captain?" Sarah asked. "She's stable. The doctors think she'll recover fully, but it's going to take months of treatment to clear the toxins from her system. She's been asking to speak with you." They drove directly to the base hospital, where Sarah found Captain looking pale and thin but alive. When saw Sarah, her eyes filled with tears. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology. I should have listened when you tried to warn us." Sarah took's hand. "Captain, you don't owe me anything. I just wish I could have convinced someone to listen sooner." "The other pilots, are they going to be okay?" "Doctor says most of them are responding well to treatment. The contamination was caught before permanent damage was done, except—" Sarah's voice trailed off. "Except for Jake," closed her eyes. "He was getting married next month, you know. His came to see me yesterday. She thanked me for surviving because she said it proved that Jake's death wasn't in vain." That afternoon, Sarah found herself in a federal courthouse in Savannah, preparing to testify before a grand jury. The investigation had expanded beyond fuel contamination to include charges of criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. Special Agent Santos briefed her on what had been discovered during the 3-week investigation. The fuel contamination was caused by deteriorating tank linings, exactly as you suspected. The tanks in question hadn't been properly inspected in over 8 years, despite regulations requiring annual inspections. Colonel knew about the inspection delays, but chose to ignore them to avoid the cost and operational disruption of tank repairs. What about my reports, my requests for testing? Deliberately suppressed your findings. We found emails between him and his staff discussing how to discredit your concerns without actually investigating them. When you went to doctor, tried to have both of you transferred to end the matter. Sarah felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Jake had died because a commander valued convenience over safety. There's more, Sergeant. Wasn't acting alone. We've identified similar cover-ups at 3 other Air Force bases. This appears to be part of a systematic pattern of ignoring infrastructure problems to maintain operational tempo and avoid budget impacts. The grand jury testimony took most of the day. Sarah presented her evidence methodically, walking the jurors through months of documented contamination, ignored warnings, and escalating pilot illness. She described dismissive attitude, the fitness evaluation designed to discredit her, and the transfer to Montana that was clearly intended to silence her. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr., who had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation. Colonel explicitly ordered me to attribute pilot symptoms to stress rather than investigate potential environmental causes, Doctor. When I raised concerns about the pattern of illness, he told me that women in the military had a tendency to over-medicalize normal stress reactions. The investigation made national news within a week. Air Force pilot dies from contaminated fuel while is silenced, read the headline in the Washington Post. Sarah found herself at the center of a story that resonated far beyond military circles. The phone calls started immediately. Reporters wanting interviews, advocacy groups supporting her cause, other military personnel who had faced similar retaliation for raising safety concerns. But the call that mattered most came from Secretary of the Air Force herself. Sergeant, I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated. The Air Force failed you, and more importantly, we failed the pilots you were trying to protect. I'm announcing a complete review of fuel system maintenance procedures across all Air Force installations. Thank you, ma'am, but what about the people responsible? Colonel has been relieved of command and is facing court-martial proceedings. The base fuel systems officer and maintenance chief are also facing charges. We're implementing new protocols to ensure that safety concerns raised by any personnel, regardless of rank, receive proper investigation. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same courthouse where she had, watching as Colonel was sentenced to 5 years in military prison for criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. The judge's words carried the weight of moral judgment as well as legal consequence. Colonel, you held a position of tremendous responsibility. Young men and women trusted you to keep them safe while they served their country. Instead, you prioritized your own career convenience over their lives. Your actions directly contributed to the death of Lieutenant and the serious illness of multiple other service members. Showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. Sarah felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness that it had taken Jake's death to bring about justice. The real vindication came 6 months later, when Sarah received a call from Dr. Sarah, I wanted you to be the first to know. The Air Force has implemented the new fuel testing protocols you recommended at every base worldwide. They're also establishing an independent safety reporting system that allows any service member to report concerns directly to Pentagon investigators, bypassing local command. And the pilots, the ones who were affected, all of them have recovered fully. Captain is back to flying status, and she's become quite an advocate for safety reporting. She credits you with saving her life. Sarah was offered her choice of assignments following the investigation. She could return to fuel systems work, with the respect and authority her expertise deserved. She could take a position at the Pentagon, helping to implement the new safety protocols. She could even leave the military with full honors and benefits. Instead, she chose to stay at Moody Air Force Base, returning to the fuel systems shop where her investigation had begun. She wanted to be there to mentor young technicians, to make sure they understood that their observations mattered, that safety concerns should never be dismissed because of rank or gender. On her first day back, Sarah found a memorial plaque that had been installed near the flight line. It read, "In memory of First Lieutenant Jake, who died in service to his country. His sacrifice reminds us that the greatest honor we can give our fallen is to learn from their loss." Sarah stood before the memorial, thinking about the young pilot with the cocky smile who had trusted the system to keep him safe. His death had been preventable, the result of institutional arrogance and willful ignorance. But his death had also changed everything. Because of Jake, pilots across the Air Force were now flying safer aircraft, fueled by systems that were properly maintained and continuously monitored. Because of his sacrifice, others would find it easier to speak truth to power. As Sarah walked back to her office, the same office where she had first discovered the fuel contamination patterns, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come at the highest cost. She had been ignored, dismissed, and nearly destroyed by a system that valued hierarchy over truth. But in the end, the truth had prevailed, and Jake's death, while tragic and unnecessary, had ultimately saved countless other lives. Sarah had learned that being right wasn't always enough. Sometimes you had to be right and brave and persistent and willing to sacrifice everything for what you believed in. Sometimes you had to be willing to be ignored, until finally, impossibly, people started to listen. The sky above Moody Air Force Base was clear that day, filled with the sound of jets taking off safely, fueled by clean gas and flown by healthy pilots. It was the sound of a system that had finally learned to listen to the warnings of those who dared to speak the truth.